The sales rep who transferred every high-value client to the competition overnight. Monday morning. 7:43 a.m. Somewhere across the city, a regional director is sitting down at his desk, coffee in hand, pulling up the CRM dashboard he has checked every Monday morning for the past 6 years. The numbers load. He sets the coffee down. The dashboard is empty. Not slow. Not partially populated. Not glitching. Empty. 20 accounts. 20 revenue relationships that together represent 60% of everything that firm earns in a calendar year. Gone. All of them. Transferred, confirmed, and onboard at a competitor before the weekend was over. I know exactly what that screen looked like. I designed the conditions that produced it. Let me be precise about what happened, because precision is the whole point. For 3 years, I was the highest performing sales representative that firm had ever employed. I built those client relationships from the ground up, cold calls, late nights, quarterly business reviews conducted on my own time, relationships maintained through my own credibility and care. The firm collected the revenue. I collected a steadily diminishing share of it, a rotating set of excuses for why commissions I had already earned were being restructured retroactively, and a regional director who had decided that intimidation was a management philosophy. They took things from me that were contractual mine. They ignored every documented complaint. They buried every HR filing. They assumed that because I had built something valuable inside their walls, I could be pressured indefinitely, that I had too much to lose to ever walk away. That assumption was the first mistake. The second was not reading their own employment contracts carefully enough to understand what voided them. In a single 12-hour window on a Friday night, for colleagues, and I submitted simultaneous resignations, transferred 20 clients to a new firm under agreements those clients had already signed, and restructured our professional lives entirely, without touching a single server we didn't own, without violating a single law, and without giving the old firm 1 hour's advance warning. By 5:47 a.m. Saturday, every client had confirmed. By Monday morning at 7:43, the dashboard was empty. Every move was deliberate. Every detail was documented. The whole operation was entirely legal. I want you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a story about anger. I was not angry by the time Friday night arrived. Anger is what you feel when something catches you off guard, when someone takes something you weren't expecting to lose. By Friday, I had been preparing for over a year. I had a private encrypted file containing 12 months of dated grievances, a signed term sheet with the new firm, an indemnity agreement that shifted all litigation risk off my shoulders, and a precise understanding of the legal framework that made every step possible. By Friday night, I was calm. Methodical. The kind of calm that comes not from indifference but from preparation so thorough that the outcome was already settled before the first move was made. What I felt on Friday night was not anger. It was certainty. The people who build operations like this one, the ones that actually work, the ones that hold up under legal scrutiny, the ones that leave the wrongdoer with no viable recourse, they don't build them out of rage. They build them the way you build anything that needs to last. Slowly. Precisely. One documented incident at a time, one contractual clause at a time, one quiet conversation at a time, until the structure is so solid that when you finally move, nothing can stop it. That is what I built. And I want to walk you through every part of it, because the satisfaction of this story is not in the ending. The ending is just an empty dashboard and a man staring at it with his coffee getting cold. The satisfaction is in understanding how thoroughly they built their own destruction, and how long they had to stop it, and how many times I gave them the chance. They chose, every single time, to keep going. So let me take you back to where this started. Not to Friday night. Not to the moment I walked into the competitors' offices for the first time, or to the afternoon I sat across from their leadership team and laid 20 client portfolios on the table like a hand of cards I already knew had won. Not even to the moment I first realized, with complete clarity, that the firm I worked for had made an enemy out of their best asset. Further back than that. Back to a Monday morning 3 years earlier, a very different Monday morning, when I believed in the place I worked, when the numbers I was producing felt like the foundation of something real, and when the phrase commission restructuring hadn't entered my vocabulary yet. Back to when this was still a story about someone doing their job well, before it became a story about what happened when the people above you mistake loyalty for leverage. Back to the beginning, because that is the only place where any of this makes complete sense, and I want it to make complete sense. I want you to understand not just what happened, but why it was inevitable. Why every decision they made, from the first clawed back commission to the last ignored HR complaint, was a brick they were laying in the foundation of their own collapse. They built this. One unpaid commission and one buried complaint at a time, they built the precise set of conditions that made everything I did not only possible but legally airtight. I just read the blueprint they didn't know they were drawing. Let me show you how it came together. Because by the time we get back to Monday morning, back to 7:43 a.m., back to the empty dashboard and the cold coffee and the man who is about to pick up the phone and discover that every client he calls is already gone, you will not be surprised. You will not be shocked. You will watch it land the way the final piece of a very long equation resolves, quietly, completely, and with the particular satisfaction of something that was always going to end exactly this way. They just didn't know it yet. I did. To understand how a company loses 60% of its revenue in a single night, you have to understand how it spent years making that outcome inevitable. So let me take you back. Not to the beginning of the end, to the beginning of what looked like the beginning. March Consulting Group, I'll call them MCG throughout, was the kind of mid-sized financial services firm that talks about culture in its job listings and then measures everything exclusively in quarterly numbers. 83 employees across 2 regional offices. A leadership team that had grown up inside the company and had mistaken longevity for wisdom. A sales structure built on the assumption that top performers would always perform, regardless of how they were treated, because where else were they going to go? I joined MCG in the spring of my 3rd year out of university, carrying a book of professional contacts that most people spend a decade building, and within 18 months I was the firm's highest performing sales representative by a margin that was not close. My accounts generated roughly 60% of annual recurring revenue. Not 60% of my team's revenue. 60% of the firm's. The math is not complicated. Without my client relationships, MCG was a mid-table regional firm scraping for market share. With them, it could present itself as a serious player in competitive pitch situations and win. For the first 2 years, that arrangement worked well for everyone. My commission structure was generous, my territory was protected, my client relationships were respected. The regional director, I'll call him Harlan throughout, because that is close enough to his name that it will mean something to the people who know this story, was performatively enthusiastic about my results in every public setting and privately indifferent to how I operated, which suited both of us. I brought in revenue. MCG deposited commissions. The relationship was transactional, and transactional was fine. Then the ownership structure changed. A private equity group took a minority stake in MCG in the 4th quarter of 2 years before the events you are here to understand. And the thing about private equity is that it does not acquire stakes in mid-sized regional firms because it finds the culture charming. It acquires them because it believes expenses can be reduced and margins can be improved. The people who get reduced are, typically, the ones who cost the most. Which meant people like me. The first signal came in a commission restructuring memo distributed on a Tuesday in March, addressed to the entire sales team but written, structurally, for exactly one person. The memo announced a retroactive adjustment to the commission calculation methodology for all contracts signed in the preceding fiscal year, meaning contracts that had already been executed, clients who had already been onboarded, revenue that had already been earned and, in most cases, already invoiced. The adjustment reduced the applicable commission rate on those contracts by 2.5 percentage points, applied retroactively, and the resulting clawback was deducted from the following month's payout without prior notice and without individual consultation. For most members of the sales team, that adjustment cost them a few $100s. For me, the clawback came to just under $14,000. In a single payroll cycle. On income one had already budgeted, already partially spent, and which I had earned under the explicit terms of the commission agreement I had signed when I joined the firm. No amendment to that agreement had been offered. No consent had been obtained. The memo was presented as an administrative correction, the way you might describe fixing a typo. I documented everything that day. The original commission agreement, signed and countersigned. The contracts that fell within the adjustment window, timestamped and filed. The calculation of the differential. A formal written objection submitted to HR within 48 hours, requesting the basis for the retroactive adjustment and the legal authority under which it was being implemented. HR acknowledged receipt. HR did not respond substantively. I kept a copy of everything in a private encrypted file I maintained outside the company's systems, my own work, my own records, my own documentation. That file would grow considerably over the following 12 months. The second incident arrived in Q3, packaged as a performance review. In any reasonable reading of my numbers, a Q3 performance review for me should have been a brief and pleasant conversation. My year-to-date revenue was 41% above target. My client retention rate was 97%. I had brought in 3 net new accounts in the preceding quarter, each of which had been personally approved as priority targets by Harlan himself at the start of the year. Instead, the review was a 90-minute exercise in selective interpretation. Harlan presented a new internal metric, pipeline velocity, a measurement I had never seen defined in any company document before that morning, and used my score on that metric to characterize my performance as inconsistent with the expectations of a senior representative. He then introduced, for the first time, the possibility that my role designation might need to be restructured if pipeline velocity did not improve in Q4. Restructured, in the vocabulary of that conversation, meant demoted. A demotion would have triggered a reclassification under my commission agreement, reducing my rate on existing accounts and removing my territory protection on 3 of my largest clients. I asked, in writing, via email sent the same afternoon, for the documented definition of pipeline velocity, the baseline expectations against which I was being measured, and the names of any senior representatives who had met those expectations in the preceding quarter. Harlan replied that these were internal benchmarking tools and not subject to individual disclosure. I added his reply to the encrypted file. The verbal intimidation was subtler, and I want to be precise about what I mean when I use that phrase, because precision matters here. I am not describing raised voices or dramatic confrontations. What Harlan practiced was quieter than that, a consistent pattern of public minimization, private pressure, and the strategic withdrawal of information that I needed to do my job effectively. Briefings I was excluded from. Client introductions I was not told about until after the fact. Casual comments in team meetings that framed my results as something the firm had produced rather than something I had produced, delivered with the mild smile of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. Every instance was noted. Every date recorded. Every email retained. 12 months of documentation, assembled not in anger but in the quiet certainty that pattern evidence is the only kind that cannot be dismissed as a misunderstanding. By the time I stopped adding entries to that file, it was 47 pages long, cross-referenced by date, incident type, and the specific contractual clause each incident implicated. MCG had spent 2 years systematically dismantling the arrangement that made me valuable to them, while simultaneously relying on my performance to sustain their revenue position. They had given me grievances. They had given me documentation. And, without knowing it, they had given me the legal foundation for everything that came next. Here is something most people never think to do until it is too late: document everything before you need it. Not after the conversation goes sideways. Not after the termination letter arrives. Before. While the wounds are still fresh and the timestamps are still clean. I started in March, the same month they restructured the commission schedule. I opened an encrypted file on a personal device, not a company machine, not a company server, not a company-owned cloud account. A device I owned. An account I paid for. That distinction would matter enormously later. Every entry was dated, time-stamped, and written in plain language: what was said, who said it, who else was in the room, and what the relevant contract clause was that the conduct appeared to violate. No editorializing. No emotional language. Just facts arranged in chronological order, the way a court prefers to read them. By April I had 14 entries. By June I had 31. By the following February, when the file became a legal exhibit, it ran to 108 pages. The HR process ran parallel to the personal log, and it is worth explaining why both mattered. The internal complaint served 2 purposes. The first was procedural. Exhausting internal remedies is a prerequisite in most employment disputes, and I was not going to hand the firm a procedural escape hatch. The second purpose was evidentiary. Every complaint I filed created a record of the firm's response, or more precisely, its non-response. A complaint filed in July about the commission clawback received a form acknowledgement and no follow-up. A complaint filed in September, documenting 3 specific incidents of verbal intimidation from the regional director, was closed within 11 days with a 1-line summary that read, reviewed and found no policy violation. That 1-line summary would later appear in a filing as evidence of a pattern of deliberate inaction. The firm was not just mistreating its employees. It was creating a documented record of its own indifference. I simply made sure that record was preserved somewhere they could not delete it. By the end of 12 months, the file contained 6 formal HR complaints with written responses, 43 dated entries describing specific incidents of commission manipulation, a spreadsheet reconciling promised compensation against actual payments with a net discrepancy of just over $61,000, and a folder of email threads in which the regional director's written communications demonstrated, in his own words, both the intimidation pattern and his awareness of the compensation disputes. He had a habit of putting things in writing that he should have said verbally. I was grateful for that habit every single time. Now, the legal mechanism, because this is where the operation moved from grievance to architecture. Most people who leave a job under a non-compete agreement assume the covenant is simply enforceable. They accept it as a wall they cannot cross. What they do not know, what the firm almost certainly counted on them not knowing, is that a non-compete agreement is a contract, and contracts are bilateral. They bind both parties. When one party materially breaches the agreement, the other party is generally released from their obligations under it. This is not a loophole. It is a foundational principle of contract law that has existed for generations. The 2026 federal framework formalized this in a way that made it operationally useful. Under the revised non-compete guidelines, when an employer has materially breached the underlying employment contract, through documented wage theft, unilateral alteration of compensation terms, or a demonstrable pattern of constructive dismissal, the court is permitted to void the restrictive covenant entirely rather than rewrite it. This is known informally as the Blue Pencil Doctrine's successor provision. Where a judge previously had discretion to trim an overreaching covenant, the new framework allows full voidance when the breach is material and documented. The key word there is documented. A grievance without a paper trail is a complaint. A grievance with 108 pages of timestamped evidence, 6 unresolved HR filings, and a $61,000 compensation discrepancy is a material breach. I retained an employment attorney in November, quietly, on a personal retainer, paid personally, not through any firm resource. We reviewed the file together over 3 meetings. Her assessment, delivered at the end of the 3rd meeting in a tone that I can only describe as professionally pleased, was that the breach documentation was among the most thorough she had reviewed in a decade of employment litigation. She said we would not be asking a court to void the covenant. We would be informing the court of why the covenant was already void, and presenting the evidence that made that conclusion unavoidable. There is a difference between those two postures. One is an argument. The other is a demonstration. With the legal structure confirmed, I turned to the second half of the operation, the client map. I had managed the firm's 20 highest value accounts for an average of 4 years each. I knew these clients the way you know the geography of a place you have lived in for a long time, not just the major landmarks, but the texture of the thing. I knew which accounts had been promised service upgrades that never materialized. I knew which clients had raised concerns that were deprioritized in favor of new acquisition targets. I knew which ones had already begun, quietly, to explore alternatives, because they had told me, in the comfortable candor that develops between a client and the person who actually picks up the phone when they call. I mapped them in a separate spreadsheet. 15 of the 20 had documented service failures, at least one instance where the firm had not delivered on a committed obligation. 9 of the 20 had raised those failures in writing, which meant the firm had a written record of client dissatisfaction it had failed to act on. 12 of the 20 were on standard agreement templates with 30-day termination provisions, meaning they could exit their contracts with the firm within a single billing cycle, without penalty, for any reason. The other 8 had bespoke agreements, and those I reviewed individually. Of the 8, 6 contained language permitting termination for cause based on service failure, and I had documentation of the relevant failures for each one. This was not a moonshot. This was arithmetic. The client map was not a list of targets. It was a list of relationships the firm had neglected to the point where those clients were effectively waiting for someone to show them the door. I was not going to steal anything. I was going to open a door that was already unlocked, and let 20 clients walk through it of their own free will, to a provider who had already committed to serving them the way they had been told they would be served and never were. By the time the attorney signed off on the legal opinion in early February, the map was complete, the file was complete, and the only remaining variable was timing. I had 12 months of documented grievances, a confirmed legal mechanism, a client portfolio ready to move, and a very clear sense of what I was prepared to do next. The only thing missing was someone on the other side of the table willing to receive it. That conversation was the next step, and it would turn out to be the shortest part of the entire operation. I did not walk into that first meeting empty-handed. That would have been amateur. I walked in with a folder, a projection model, and a proposition so clean that the only rational response was yes. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before the folder, there was a choice, and the choice was not which competitor to approach. I had already mapped that. The choice was how to approach them without triggering a rumor, without alerting anyone at the old firm, and without appearing desperate. Desperation is the one thing that poisons a negotiation before it begins. I was not desperate. I was methodical. There is a difference, and the difference shows. I had been watching Callaway Regional Partners for about 8 months by this point. Mid-sized firm, well-capitalized, hungry for market share in exactly the segment where I had spent 6 years building relationships. They had the infrastructure, the compliance team, the service platform. What they lacked was a book. A real book. The kind of deep-rooted, recurring revenue client portfolio that takes years to cultivate and can transform a firm's market position almost overnight. They knew they lacked it. Their regional VP, a man named Daniel Forsyth, had said as much in a trade publication interview 3 quarters earlier. I had saved the quote. I bring it with me to the first meeting. The outreach itself is unremarkable on its surface. A LinkedIn message, professional, brief, no specifics. I mentioned that I am exploring strategic options and that I believe there may be an alignment worth discussing over lunch. I do not mention clients. I do not mention the old firm by name. I mention only that I manage a significant recurring revenue portfolio and that I prefer conversations that happen before decisions are made, not after. Forsyth responds within 4 hours. We schedule for the following Tuesday. The restaurant is a mid-range Italian place 20 minutes outside the city center, close enough to be convenient, far enough that no one from either firm is likely to walk past the window. I arrive 8 minutes early. I order water. I review my notes one final time and put them away before he arrives, because a man who needs to consult his notes during a first meeting is a man who does not fully own what he is selling. Forsyth arrives on time. We exchange pleasantries for approximately 4 minutes, which is the correct amount. Then I open the folder. The first page is a revenue summary, anonymized, but structured with enough granularity that any experienced operator can see immediately that this is not a rough estimate. 20 accounts. Weighted average relationship tenure of 4.3 years. Annual recurring revenue figure that I will not repeat here, but which causes Forsyth to set down his water glass and look at me with an expression I can only describe as careful attention. The second page is a market positioning analysis, what this portfolio would mean for Callaway's regional ranking if it transferred intact. Third in the region, conservatively. Potentially second within 18 months. I do not oversell it. I let the numbers do the work they were designed to do. Forsyth asks the obvious question, why now, and why Callaway? I give him the honest answer, which also happens to be the strategic one. The current employer has materially breached my employment contract. I have documented that breach thoroughly. Under the applicable federal framework, that breach voids the restrictive covenants I signed. I am not running from an obligation, the obligation has been legally dissolved. And I am bringing the conversation to Callaway first because their platform is the right fit for these clients, and because I have no interest in starting a new chapter with a firm I have to convince of its own capability. Forsyth listens. He does not interrupt. When I finish, he asks about timeline. I tell him I need a start date no later than the following Friday. He asks why Friday specifically. I tell him that is when the certified electronic resignations will be delivered, and that I prefer the operation to begin the moment the window opens rather than leaving any gap for complications. He nods slowly. He understands precisely what I mean. The second meeting happens 3 days later, this time with Forsyth and Callaway's general counsel, a precise and unhurried woman named Kathleen Merris. Merris has clearly reviewed my documentation in advance. She asks targeted questions about the breach evidence, the HR complaint history, and the specific federal provision I am relying on. Her questions are good. I have better answers. By the end of the meeting, she tells Forsyth that the legal position is defensible, that the indemnity exposure is manageable, and that she would want one specific clause inserted into the term sheet before anything is signed. That clause is the load-bearing structure of this entire plan. The indemnity agreement binds Callaway Regional Partners to cover all legal defense costs in the event that my former employer initiates litigation against me or any member of the transition team, provided the litigation arises from the circumstances disclosed in the documentation I have presented. This is not unusual in competitive talent acquisitions at this level. What makes it significant here is what it removes from the equation: risk. My personal financial exposure. The exposure of my 4 colleagues, each of whom has their own documented grievances and their own reasons for walking. Without that clause, the operation requires each of us to absorb the cost of a potential legal fight on top of the disruption of changing firms. With it, the calculus is simple. We are protected. The plan can execute cleanly. I spend the better part of 2 days reviewing Meris's draft with my own attorney, a meticulous woman who specializes in employment transitions and who has been quietly advising me since the wage clawback in March. She flags 2 language issues in the indemnity clause, both of which Meris accepts without significant resistance. The revised draft comes back within 24 hours. On Thursday evening at 7:18 p.m., I sign the term sheet. Forsyth signs at 7:31 p.m. Meris witnesses both signatures electronically. The start date is confirmed, the following Friday 6:01 p.m. I send a single message to each of my 4 colleagues, nothing elaborate, nothing that could be misconstrued as coordination in any problematic sense, because the documentation we have already established makes that coordination unnecessary. The message reads, Friday, 6 p.m. We are ready. All 4 respond within the hour. 4 of them say yes. The 5th, the one I had considered a long shot, responds last, at 11:52 p.m., with a single word. Finally. The meeting had lasted 40 minutes. The negotiation had taken 11 days. The plan had taken 12 months to make possible. And now all of it was aimed at a single Friday evening, with a start time chosen not for drama, but for precision, 6:01 p.m., 1 minute past the official end of the business week, which is the exact moment that our final paychecks would be deposited and our last contractual obligation to the old firm would be fulfilled. Every detail matters. Every minute is chosen. This is how you build something that cannot be undone. Everything that followed was a matter of execution. Not speed. Not improvisation. Execution, the kind that only looks effortless because every variable was resolved weeks in advance. The date was the 2nd Friday of November. The time was 6:01 p.m. 5 people. 5 laptops. 5 resignation letters, each one a precision instrument. Mine ran to 4 pages. The others ran to 3. Every letter cited specific dates, specific dollar amounts, specific incidents, the March Commission clawback, the Q3 review that was weaponized as a demotion threat, the recorded verbal conduct from the regional director that the firm's own HR department had acknowledged receiving and then quietly filed into a folder that was never opened again. Each letter invoked the material breach clause by name. Each letter declared the non-compete covenant void on its face. Each letter was delivered via certified electronic transmission with time-stamped read receipts built into the delivery protocol. We did not send them one by one. We sent them simultaneously, from 5 separate devices, at precisely the same second. That synchronization was not theatrical. It was structural. It meant that no single resignation could be processed, responded to, or legally distinguished from the others before all 5 were already in the record. By 6:03 p.m., all 5 letters had confirmed delivery. We gave ourselves 2 minutes to breathe. Then we moved. The client communication packages had been staged for 11 days. 20 separate folders, each one built around a specific account, the account service history, the unmet needs we had logged during the relationship, and a transition letter signed by me personally explaining what was happening and why. The tone of those letters was not apologetic. It was not dramatic. It was the tone of a trusted advisor letting a valued relationship know that the relationship was continuing, only the address had changed. Each package included a new service agreement, preloaded into a secure portal that the incoming firm had provisioned specifically for this transition. The portal required nothing more than a single confirmation click to countersign. We had tested it 48 hours earlier. The average completion time was under 4 minutes. At 6:15 p.m., the first batch of 10 packages went out. At 6:34 p.m., the second batch of 10 followed. And then we waited. The first confirmation came back at 6:41 p.m., a manufacturing group out of the Mid-Atlantic region that had been expressing dissatisfaction with response times for the better part of a year. They did not ask questions. They signed. At 6:58 p.m., 2 more. At 7:12 p.m., another 3 arrived within the same 4-minute window, as though those 3 clients had been talking to each other, which, in retrospect, they may well have been. By 8 p.m., we were at 9 confirmations. 9 out of 20 in under 2 hours. I want to be precise about what that number represents. These were not impulsive decisions made in the heat of an email. These were clients who had been underserved for months, who had been absorbing degraded response times and unresolved service issues because the firm's internal dysfunction had been quietly bleeding outward into every client relationship it touched. The speed of their confirmations was not a compliment to our outreach. It was a measurement of how ready they already were. We kept working. There were questions to answer, procedural questions, mostly, about data migration and point of contact continuity. One client wanted a call before signing. We took it at 8:47 p.m., walked through the transition timeline in detail, answered every question with the documentation already open in front of us, and had a countersignature by 9:14 p.m. Midnight arrived with 16 of the 20 confirmed. The remaining 4 were not lost, they were slower. One was a large institutional account whose internal approval process required a second signatory who was traveling. One was a family-owned business whose principal made a point of never reviewing documents after business hours, a discipline I had always respected about them. The other 2 were simply cautious, which was entirely reasonable, and which we had anticipated. All 4 had received follow-up messages at 10:30 p.m., not pressure, just a confirmation that the portal would remain open and that we were available for any questions at any hour. At 2:19 a.m., the institutional account countersigned. Their second signatory had apparently been reached by phone. At 4:05 a.m., the family business came through. I imagine the principal made an exception to the after-hours rule. The remaining 2 arrived within the same 11-minute window, between 5:36 and 5:47 a.m. Saturday. All 20. I want to be direct about one thing, because it matters, both legally and as a matter of principle. At no point during those 12 hours did anyone access the old firm's servers, databases, or internal systems. Not a single file was pulled from a company drive. Not a single internal record was copied, downloaded, or transferred. The client communication packages were built entirely from the narrator's own documented work product, meeting notes kept in personal files, relationship histories maintained in private logs, service records that the clients themselves had shared directly with us in the course of normal business. The new service agreements were drafted from scratch by the incoming firm's legal team. That distinction was not incidental. It was the architecture of the entire operation's legal defensibility. Every piece of data that moved on Friday night was either owned by the clients themselves or by the individuals doing the moving. Nothing that belonged to the old firm moved. Nothing. By 6 a.m. Saturday, the 5 of us were sitting in a conference room at the new firm's regional office. Coffee had been provided. The incoming firm's chief revenue officer was already reviewing the confirmation log. 20 for 20. The revenue projection from the original term sheet had assumed a 60% acceptance rate as the conservative baseline. We had cleared 100% in under 12 hours. No one celebrated loudly. There was no dramatic moment of triumph. There was a quiet, collective acknowledgement that the plan had held, that every piece of preparation, every documented incident, every carefully worded letter, every staged portal, every timed delivery had performed exactly as designed. The regional director was at home that Saturday, presumably unaware. By Monday morning, that would change. The operation was complete. The evidence was clean. The clients were transferred. And the old firm's Monday was already written, they simply did not know it yet. Let me tell you what Monday morning looked like from the other side of the building. We were not there. We were already at the new office, settling into chairs that did not yet have our names on them, drinking coffee from a machine we did not yet know how to use, watching our phones light up with confirmation after confirmation from clients we had spent years serving. We were calm. We were exactly where we planned to be. But I know what happened at the old firm at 8:15 a.m. on Monday, because people who were still there told me later, in detail, with dates, the way people do when they have been waiting a long time to describe something to someone who will understand it. Richard Hollis, regional director, badge number on file, arrived at the office 9 minutes behind schedule. That part, apparently, was not unusual. He stopped at the front desk, made a comment about the weekend's football scores, took the elevator to the 4th floor, set his bag down on his chair, and opened his laptop. The CRM dashboard loaded in approximately 4 seconds. He would later tell the firm's general counsel that his first thought was that the system had crashed. That the numbers he was seeing were a display error. That someone had accidentally reset a filter and the real accounts were still there, somewhere underneath, waiting to be found. He spent several minutes, this was confirmed, clicking through submenus and refreshing the screen before accepting what the screen was telling him. 0 active high-value accounts. Not low. Not reduced. 0. The column that had previously held 20 entries, each one color-coded green for active and current, was white. Every row. Every field. The accounts were not deleted. The system had simply updated to reflect reality, each one now listed under a status code that the software used for voluntary client departures. Closed at client request. Closed at client request. Closed at client request. 20 times. He called the head of client services first. She did not pick up. Her chair, he would discover when he walked down the hall, was empty. Her monitor was off. Her desk had the specific kind of tidiness that comes not from being cleaned in a hurry but from being quietly cleared over the course of several days, a drawer left open, a single pen remaining in a cup that had previously held a dozen. The tidiness of someone who knew they were leaving and had time to do it with dignity. All for support team desks in that corridor were the same. The phone system was already rerouting. 3 clients had called the main line before 9 o'clock. The call logs, which I was provided as part of the subsequent legal documentation, show the same pattern across all 3. The client asks to speak with their account manager by name, the receptionist places them on hold, the hold resolves to a generic voicemail box, and the client does not leave a message. They had already been on board elsewhere. They were calling, if anything, out of a residual habit, the way you sometimes reach for a light switch in a room you have not lived in for years. By 9 a.m., Richard had forwarded all 5 resignation letters to the General Counsel's office and the firm's Human Resources Director. The letters were identical in structure and nearly identical in language, each one citing specific clauses of each individual employment contract, specific dated instances of material breach, and a formal invocation of the right to immediate departure without penalty under the applicable framework. They were time-stamped 6:01 p.m. Friday. They had been sitting in his inbox for 62 hours. He had not checked his email over the weekend. The emergency all-hands was called for 10:30 a.m. 23 people attended, the full remaining staff of the regional office. I'm told Richard opened the meeting by describing the situation as a coordinated departure that the firm was already taking legal steps to address. He used the word unlawful 3 times in the first 4 minutes. He told the room that the clients in question had been solicited improperly and that the agreements they had signed with the new firm would not hold. The room, by most accounts, was quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when the people in them know something that the person speaking does not. Someone asked whether there was a plan for retaining the remaining clients, the smaller accounts, the ones that had not been part of the transition. Richard said the firm was focused on recovering the departed accounts first. Someone else asked whether commissions for the current quarter would be paid on schedule. Richard said that was a separate conversation. The meeting ended 31 minutes after it began. 6 people tendered their resignations before noon that day. They were not part of our operation. They had simply been watching the same firm for longer than was advisable and had finally seen, in one morning's worth of dashboard readings and empty chairs, what staying was actually worth. The frantic phone calls to clients began before the all-hands meeting ended. Richard personally called 7 of the 20 accounts between 9:45 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. The call logs exist. Not one of them lasted more than 3 minutes. The clients were polite, uniformly so, which is its own kind of message. There was no anger, no dispute, no drama. Several of them mentioned that they had already completed their onboarding with the new firm and were satisfied with the transition. One of them thanked Richard for the years of service. One of them asked to be removed from the firm's contact list. None of them asked for their old accounts back. By noon on Monday, the firm's legal team had confirmed internally what the General Counsel had suspected from the first reading of those resignation letters, that the departures had been executed against a documented record of employer breach, that the covenant language the firm had relied upon for years was precisely the language that the applicable doctrine allowed to be voided under those conditions, and that the 20 client transfers had been made using only client-owned data and the departing employee's own documented work product. There was nothing in the system that should not have been taken. There was nothing taken that gave them a clean hook. The Monday that Richard Hollis arrived at work expecting to manage a normal week ended with a near-empty floor, a silent phone system, a CRM that looked like a cleared table, and a legal team that was already telling him the emergency injunction they were planning to file was going to be a difficult argument to make. It was the kind of morning that does not come from a single mistake. It comes from years of them, stacked with care, by someone who was no longer in the building to hear what happened next. They moved fast. I will give them that. By Wednesday morning, 71 hours after the resignation letters landed, the old firm's legal counsel had filed for an emergency temporary restraining order in federal district court, seeking to halt the client transitions, compel the return of what they called misappropriated proprietary data, and reinstate the non-compete agreements they claimed we had violated. The filing was aggressive, the language was theatrical, and the underlying case was built almost entirely on sand. I was not surprised. We had written the counterattack into the plan before the plan had a name. The indemnity clause with the new firm meant our legal defense was already funded before the old firm's attorneys had finished drafting. Our own counsel, retained 6 weeks prior to the operation, briefed on every document in the encrypted log, filed a response within 18 hours. Not a motion to delay. A response. Detailed, precise, and accompanied by 412 pages of exhibits. Those exhibits told a simple story, told very clearly. Exhibit A through Exhibit F, 6 instances of retroactive commission restructuring between March and November, with the original written agreements attached alongside the unilateral amendments that had been imposed without consent. Exhibit G through Exhibit L, the HR complaint submissions, each stamped with a date received, each followed by a documented non-response or a reply that amounted to administrative burial. Exhibit M, the Q3 performance review, annotated with the specific language that constituted a constructive demotion threat under Section 4 of the employment contract. Exhibit N through Exhibit R, the verbal intimidation incidents, each one logged within 24 hours of occurrence, each one corroborated by at least one written follow-up from the narrator to a third party, creating a contemporaneous record that no one had thought to prevent. The judge reviewed the emergency filing on Thursday afternoon. She declined to grant the temporary restraining order. Not deferred, declined. Her written ruling, issued the same day, was 4 paragraphs. The operative paragraph read, in summary, the moving party had not demonstrated a likelihood of success on the merits sufficient to justify emergency injunctive relief, given the substantial evidence of prior material breach presented by the respondents. 4 paragraphs. For years of accumulated misconduct, neutralized in 4 paragraphs. The old firm had 60 days to file for a preliminary injunction hearing. They did not file. Their counsel sent a letter in week 7 indicating they were evaluating their litigation posture. That is the legal equivalent of a man checking his pockets after learning his wallet is already gone. By week 9, the case was quietly withdrawn. Now the numbers. Because the numbers are where the full weight of what they built for themselves becomes visible. In the week following the Monday morning when that dashboard went dark, the old firm lost 91% of its annual recurring revenue. Not projected revenue. Contracted, invoiced, already on the books revenue, the kind that gets written into a firm's valuation model as a reliable baseline. Gone. The 20 accounts that transitioned were not simply the top accounts by volume. They were the accounts that had been generating cross-referral relationships, the accounts whose renewal rates had been supporting the firm's credit terms with 3 separate vendors. Pull them out, and the remaining portfolio did not just shrink, it became structurally unsound. Within 30 days, the firm entered what they internally called a strategic resource realignment. Their staff received the announcement in an all-hands meeting on the 28th day. What it meant in practice, 2 floors of leased office space were quietly surrendered, the support team was reduced by more than half, and 2 of the remaining senior sales staff submitted their own resignations within the following 2 weeks. Not coordinated. Not part of our plan. Simply the natural consequence of capable people recognizing a sinking structure when they are standing inside one. By month 3, the firm had retained a restructuring advisor. By month 5, they had retained an investment bank to explore what the advisor carefully described as strategic alternatives. 8 months after that Monday morning, 8 months after a dashboard showed 0, the firm was acquired. The price was not disclosed, but the terms were reported in a regional business publication as a distressed asset transaction. The acquiring entity was a larger national firm that had been circling the space for 2 years, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. They paid for the remaining infrastructure and the brand. The clients were not part of the deal. There were none left to include. I want to be precise about something, because precision is what this entire operation was built on. We did not destroy that firm. They did not collapse because of a single Friday evening. They collapsed because of March's commission clawback, and the Q3 review used as a weapon, and the HR complaints that were filed and buried, and the verbal intimidation that was never addressed, and the years of treating their highest-performing people as if the revenue those people generated belonged to the institution rather than to the relationships those people had spent years building. We did not introduce a single new variable into their system. We simply allowed the system they had constructed to reach its natural conclusion on an accelerated timeline. Every unpaid commission was a brick they removed from their own foundation. Every ignored complaint was a load-bearing wall they decided they did not need. Every threat made to someone who was quietly taking notes was a calculation they made incorrectly. The regional director, the one who arrived at 8:15 a.m. on that Monday to an empty dashboard and a silent phone system, left the firm before the acquisition closed. I have no particular feeling about that. His departure was not a victory. It was simply what happens when the structure around a person gives way. I closed my first quarter at the new firm at 134% of target. The 16 clients who countersigned by midnight on that Friday night have since expanded their agreements. The remaining 4 expanded theirs within 90 days. The indemnity agreement was never triggered because the litigation never reached a stage that required it. The team that came with me has since grown by 3. That is what the ledger looks like from our side. From their side, it looks like a distressed asset transaction and a regional business publication notice that most people scrolled past. They built that outcome. One decision at a time, one ignored complaint at a time, one clawed back commission at a time. We simply made sure we were positioned correctly when it arrived. That is all this ever was. Positioning. The next story starts with a non-disclosure agreement and ends with one.